Assalamu alaikum. I'm Mohammed Quraishi, and we're on another episode of The Real Agenda. Tonight we have Brother FAISAL Muhammad. FAISAL Muhammad is a historian as well as a political analyst. He's worked and well-traveled around the Muslim world, and we're going to endeavor tonight to get into the hot topic of the day, which is the return of the Taliban in Afghanistan and all the surrounding events that are currently unfolding. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our guest, Brother FAISAL. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. How are you, Muhammad?
I'm doing well. FAISAL, look, a lot's happened in the past week or so. We've had, in a short amount of time, we've had the Taliban recapture most of that country, up until the point recently where we saw the former president flee from that country, and the Islamic Emirate has been declared for the whole country. A bit of background, what actually has happened? How come the Taliban have come so quickly and, in such a short amount of time?
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين أما بعد. Short question, but I think we could be spending all night giving the answer for that one. In my humble opinion, I think we should be referring to them as the Neo-Taliban or Taliban 2.0, because one thing's for sure, they're not the same Taliban that we saw in 95 and 96 under Mullah Omar, rahimahullah.
Rahmatullah.
A few questions come from your questions, to be honest with you.
I think even at that point, before we look at, what's just happened in the last couple of weeks, maybe we need to, look into that question and look further back, just how did things come to the point where they are now? And I'm looking at the situation and it's like, look, we know what happened. Taliban came to power with Mullah Omar, rahmatullah, like you've mentioned. And, we had that era that was under the reign of Mullah Omar. And, Mullah Omar's, he's not around anymore. He's passed away. And, things happened. 9/11 happened. Taliban came to power. 9/11 happened. Then the Americans decided that they were the enemy and they need to get rid of them. So they decided to invade along with Britain and others. So there's been an ongoing 20-year conflict, but not so long ago, Mullah Omar had passed away. But there was an issue at the time of his passing away. Like, why did Taliban hide the death of Mullah Omar rahimahullah for a good 2 years?
That's a very good question, and perhaps it's at the heart of the matter. It's the departure, as it were, from the authentic Taliban to the neo-Taliban or Taliban 2.0 or 3.0 that we're now seeing today? Why did, in fact, they hide the death of Mullah Omar? Was he assassinated? When I say assassinated, we're not speaking necessarily about an external assassination. Was there an internal feud going on? Because one of the biggest mistakes I think that we've all made is that we've looked at the Taliban as a monolith. The Taliban didn't start off as a monolith, and as events have proven, it's not a monolith. The Taliban is a group of disparate people who happen to have a particular objective at that given time, which was to stop lawlessness in Afghanistan. We can see very clearly that within the Taliban now, you have the Quetta Shura, you have the Haqqani network elements, you have the son of Mullah Muhammad Yaqub. You have a disparate bunch of people who've come together, and here we're not questioning sincerity, but questions need to be asked, because I, for one, have been on the tarmac, as it were, for the last 30 years. I actually remember in December 1979 when the Russians invaded Afghanistan, or the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. I remember I was about 11, 12 years old watching it on the TV. So I've grown up with this. Of course, the events in Afghanistan even predate that. In 1973, Dawood Khan, the cousin of the erstwhile king of Afghanistan, Zahir Shah, overthrew his cousin and set up a republic. And then throughout the 70s, just prior to the Soviets invading, you had coup and counter-coup. Of course, coming back to this present issue of Taliban 2.0, yes, many of us, I'm hard pushed to pick out one particular moment, but nevertheless, I'm sure anyone with any Islamic emotion or sympathy would not have been affected by seeing a group of people with beards and turbans and white flags with the Shahadatain on them. Of course, it's something that's close to our hearts. But as the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ told us, that the believer is never stung in the same place twice. The question is, and these are very valid questions, why is it that since 2018, we'll come to the issue of Mullah Omar's Rahimahullah's passing away in a sec, but the question that I would like to discuss is, why is it that the Americans overtly met with the Taliban in Qatar since 2018? That's, I think, a fundamental question that should be asked, when really the issue was the Taliban said, we will keep on fighting in Afghanistan until all foreign forces have left. But here you are meeting the political leadership of those foreign forces in another country. I mean, there seems to be a slight disconnect there. Coming to the passing away of Mullah Omar Hafidhullah, some people may argue that they kept his death a secret out of strategic reasoning, i.e. that perhaps a loss of morale would occur. But, you know, as Muslims, when Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the greatest of creation, the best of mankind, the seal of the prophets to mankind, when he made parda with this dunya, when he left this dunya, Sayyidina Umar bin al-Khattab radiallahu anh threatened to kill anybody who had said so. And then Sayyidina Abu Bakr Siddiq radiallahu anh's immortal words were, anyone who worshipped Muhammad, I let you know he has died, but anyone who worshipped Allah, know that he never will die. He is forevermore. So the question is, if the Taliban was based upon an Islamic premise, surely the passing away of an Amir should not in any way or form have affected the continuation, because it's the belief, it's the idea, it's not the individual that we cater for. So there's a lot of question marks. I mean, I've been doing a bit of research, and there seems to be a lot of fluidity. I mean, there's some people who even analyze that he was even assassinated internally. ISI the name of ISI, the Pakistani Inter-Services Intelligence, has cropped up. It's just up in the air.
It's up in the
but
air.
nevertheless, yeah. But nevertheless, the personality himself should never have been the premise of the group.
Yeah, that's a fair point. So you mentioned, we've made this term now, post Mullah Omar, of the neo-Taliban, the new Taliban 2.0, as you call it.
Excuse me.
So why did this neo-Taliban? Why did they even accept negotiations with, with the previous Afghan government and the US government? Prior to that, there was always this thing that it was a double, two-sided thing. On the other side, the West was saying we do not negotiate with terrorists. Yeah, and the Taliban were basically saying that the only thing we're going to talk about is the terms of your surrender, and so it was just bipolar almost. But now you've got these deals being made, negotiations taking place. Doha, we saw in February the signing of an agreement. Where did it come from that to this issue where both the Afghan and the US governments are being negotiated with? And what were the agreements? Whether the ones we saw in Qatar, and who knows which others?
If the overall objective is power for the sake of power, then there's nothing you won't sign. It's as simple as that. If the objective is power for the sake of power, then there's nothing to which you will not put your signature. There is nothing to which you will not discuss. So this is a deal with the devil in every sense of the word. This is a Freud. This is a deal with the devil. I can't put it in any other terms.
Okay, but
it's unfortunate. It's unfortunate that it's come to that, but the events on the ground lend ample evidence to that. I mean, we've already laid down the premise that the Taliban or the neo-Taliban have said that we will not stop fighting till foreign troops leave. But yet you're negotiating, and you were clearly negotiating with them. The issue, furthermore, is on the 28th of July this year, the Taliban going to China and saying to China, we're not going to allow Afghanistan to be a springboard or to be used, excuse me, it's not going to be used as a camp for nascent mujahideen from East Turkestan. So the question is, and if I go by the press conferences that have been carried out by the Taliban themselves, namely on Sunday and earlier today, where Zabiullah Mujahid clearly stated that we will not allow our country to be used by quote unquote terrorists. We will abide by all international agreements. We will abide by this. We will not impose this. So then the question arises, why were you fighting for the last 20 years then if you're going to totally, utterly capitulate to all terms and conditions? The question is, did you really win? What did you win? If you're capitulating, what did you win? What did you fight for?
I mean, that's actually, that sounds quite, if you think about it, because the early days. I mean, you've mentioned this, and now I'm thinking in terms of Taliban under Mullah Omar 1.0 and the new 2.0. We did have. I keep going back to that. We did have this thing. All we are going to accept is your surrender and nothing else. We don't accept that you've occupied our country. We don't accept the fact that you've installed a puppet government that just serves what you want. We don't accept any of these. We just want you out, and there is no negotiation. You accept, how quickly you get out of this place. So, what is being agreed to, and why is there need? If a foreign invader has occupied your land, and the end game is just to expel that invader, what are these negotiations in between? Why should there be any conditions for an invader leaving?
Unconditional surrender or unconditional terms and conditions has often been used in past conflicts. For example, during World War II, when the Allied powers under Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill, they demanded the unconditional surrender of Germany and Japan. Unconditional, obviously, without meaning to patronize anyone, means that you're just going to surrender. There are no terms, no conditions, no what ifs, no what buts, just surrender. That's it.
Yeah.
And as you mentioned, after 2001, when the American-led NATO forces attacked and subsequently occupied Afghanistan, that was what was on the agenda. You surrender, that's it. No negotiation, no discussion. And on the other foot, the then Taliban said the same thing. They said, there's no negotiation with you. You're an invading, occupying force. We're not going to discuss with anyone, least of all your puppets, until you leave the country. And one of the conditions that was literally written in stone by the original Taliban and even the Taliban post Mullah Omar, rahimahullah, was that negotiations only start with the government in Afghanistan or the puppet government when foreign forces leave. That was always written in stone. So I'm at a loss. I'm being very polite here when I say I'm at a loss, I'm being very polite here and perhaps a bit too overtly brotherly when I say, so what was 2018 about then? When the Doha Qatar talk started with the US and the puppet government, erstwhile puppet government in Kabul. Everything keeps on going back to that, because unless we can answer that question, then our analysis, our perspective on what is happening now in Afghanistan will not materialize.
So, okay, we've got that negotiation in 2018, culminating in, I think, February, was it this year, a signing of an agreement. So what does this agreement entail where we can say they've departed from the original, where it's like unconditional withdrawal, nothing else?
I mean, I'm a simple man, so I look at things simply. It just seems as clear as a light of day that Taliban 2.0 offered the Americans a better deal than Ashraf Ghani, who incidentally I've heard has escaped to Dubai with approximately $180 million in cash. That just came across from Reuters a couple of hours ago. So probably they just offered them a better deal. The Americans got a better deal, and that's all it boils down to.
Okay, let me ask, if that was the case, then let me ask something else. How can America get a better deal from quote-unquote Taliban than their own puppet government that they put in there? How does that even work?
No, that's a very good question. And the simple answer is that in politics and in analysis, it's like a tree. You plant the seed, then the roots and the branches and the twigs take off in all directions. It's not a single road. We can't discount the fact here that the Taliban's existence and its positioning is directly linked to Islamabad.
Okay, interesting.
Here, it has to be said, Pakistan's silence has been the loudest.
Okay, it have been pretty quiet until recently when Imran Khan spoke about how it should have happened in the first place and then America's got it wrong. But apart from these anecdotal statements from Imran Khan, we don't hear much from them, if anything.
Their silence is part of this whole thing, because the biggest winner, undoubtedly, since Ashraf Ghani's ejection, departure, running away, fleeing, any adjectives, please send them to USTADH Mohammed Al-Quraishi. It's very clear Pakistan has won. Pakistan is the main winner.
Okay,
and I'll perhaps throw in a couple of pieces of evidence to corroborate what I've been saying. we're going to go back in history a bit. During the 1970s, 71 in particular, the Americans approached Pakistan to act as a broker with the People's Republic of China, i.e. the Communist China, because at that time, the world had only recognized Taiwan, which was nationalist China, as the representative of China in the United Nations. In fact, nationalist China sat on the seat of the Chinese delegate at the United Nations Permanent Assembly, Security Council. Now, America wanted a rapprochement with Communist China. At that time, Pakistan was a strong American ally. Why were they a strong American ally? Because they were America's natural pathway to China. Because as we know, Chinese-Pakistani relationship stretches back to 1963 in the aftermath of the first Chinese-Indian War, where China gave India a resounding beating in the Himalayas. Since then, Pakistan and China have been, you have to say, bosom buddies. Their relationship has been immovable to the extent that just a couple of years ago, the Pakistani Prime Minister said that, and I quote, that the Chinese have been absolutely loyal, absolutely loyal allies to Pakistan. It was a thumbs up at the Americans, because as we know, the Americans have always been a fair weather friend to Pakistan, putting arms sanctions on them in 65, in 71, conflicts with India, and Pressler Accord in 1992, where they wouldn't give the F-16s, which Pakistan paid for, and putting sanctions on Pakistan in the aftermath of the nuclearization of the Pakistan military in 96, 97. So we can see very clearly that now, with the rising power of China, especially in the South China Sea, in East Asia, in North Asia, in Northeast Asia, in East Asia, and in Southeast Asia, with the rise of China, with its fleet now running rampant in the South China Sea, and the economic might of China, the Americans have gone begging to Pakistan like they did in 71 to act as brokers with China. And the Pakistanis have basically said, well, nothing's for free. We want Afghanistan in return. In the aftermath of 2001 in particular, we saw that the Americans came down very hard on Pakistan, to the extent that the Assistant Secretary of State, Richard Armitage, threatened to bomb Pakistan back to the Stone Age.
Yeah, I remember that.
So we can see very clearly that, especially since 2001 under Bush 2, especially under the rule, especially during the second mandate of Bush 2, during the mandates of Obama, and clearly during the mandate of Trump, the Americans ejected or abandoned Pakistan and turned to India. Now, the question is now, India itself has invested heavily in Afghanistan to the tune of $1 trillion US dollars. They've built infrastructure. They've built 2 massive dams, one of which, the Salma Dam, directly affects water flow into Pakistan, and which is a casus belli in international law, which can be a cause of war. Now, just to conclude, and perhaps we can touch upon this point later on, the Americans, needing the Pakistanis as brokers like they did during the 70s, have handed Afghanistan, one of the benefits being on the plate to Pakistan, to the detriment of India. And all of this happened coincidentally on the 15th of August, which is
the Independence Days
of Indian Independence Day. So this was a massive victory politically for Pakistan in every sense of the word, because the Americans have now come back begging to them. They've got defense in depth, because Pakistani military doctrine seeks defense in depth. Pakistan being a narrow country, in the event of an Indian attack invasion, the army needs territory to basically retreat into. Afghanistan, due to issues relating to the border, the Durand line between Afghanistan and Pakistan, which have been unresolved since the 19th century, since the British have been there. The only time, ironically, Pakistan has felt comfortable enough to face India without having to look over its shoulders at Afghanistan was when? From 1996 to 2001, when Taliban were in power. So you can see this issue isn't a unitary issue. It's a multifaceted issue with benefits for many people throughout. Like I said, arguably speaking, the biggest loser has been India. They've spent trillions in Pakistan, in Afghanistan. They had 5 consulates there. They had an embassy. They built thousands of kilometers of road. They built dams. They built schools. All for nothing now, because now the Taliban not only have a shining brand new military, they have a new infrastructure as well.
I mean, at the moment, we can see how India is treating Muslims there, especially in Kashmir. It's been atrocious, virtually a genocide is being committed over there. Yet why would this India, especially with its current government that's been, very anti-Muslim, seek to invest so much in a country called Afghanistan, which is also a Muslim country?
Right. Just like we've said that the Taliban in particular is not a monolith, now you can multiply that 1,000 and say India by all means is not a monolith. Without doubt, you have the narrow-minded, fanatical, terroristic government in place, which seeks Hindutva, which is Hindu rule in India. But you have a long-standing bureaucracy and intelligence agency in India, which looks for the political, geopolitical interests of that country. As I said previously, just a few minutes ago, Afghanistan has never really been conducive towards Pakistan, because in 1947, Afghanistan refused to recognize Pakistan at the United Nations. Excuse me, I'm just putting on the... Afghanistan refused to recognize Pakistan at the United Nations because of the Durand line, because of the border that cuts through the two countries. And in 1965, when Pakistan was at war with India, Afghanistan mobilized its border with Pakistan to put added pressure on Pakistan. And there have been border clashes intermittently over the last 50 odd years.
And that's apart from when you said from 1996 to 2000, when the Taliban was there, that they had a good, strong ally in Afghanistan, to the effect that they could, have a good, backbone there.
All their focus was towards India at that period. Now, you asked a very good question, which I think demands a bit of time, regarding why is it that such a fanatical Hindu government in India would be conducive, quote unquote, to Afghanistan. Now, I've already given you the background that the Afghan governments have traditionally been anti-Pakistan. India's involvement in that country was during the Karzai and Ashraf Ghani regimes in particular, but predates them by decades. But when we're talking over the last 10, 20 years, India wanted to solidify the anti-Taliban elements, the anti-religious elements in Afghanistan by building the infrastructure, which in their view would stabilize the government and make it more amenable to the people. So this is to do with foreign policy. You're now seeing in the Indian media that effectively now the Indian media, no doubt supported by the government, are whipping up a nascent terrorist organization in the Panjshir Valley, the north central part of Afghanistan, which is traditionally peopled by the Tajiks. whose leader was Ahmed Shah Massoud.
Okay.
Now, just yesterday and today, just on this final point, just yesterday and today, the vice president of erstwhile Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, Amrul Saleh, has been broadcasting from the Panjshir Valley, saying that he's gathered troops together and Tajiks together and any other minorities ready to fight the Taliban. And the Indians are actively encouraging that.
So you're saying clearly there's a movement now in the Tajik sector, which is basically backed by India to resist the Taliban.
Well, it's not what I'm saying, it's what India's propagating.
Well,
it's not what I'm saying, it's what they're propagating, that they're actively inciting this, and this may ultimately lead to active Indian involvement in Afghanistan.
Well, there you have it, folks. You've got further Indian involvement in Afghanistan. We'll get back to this critical subject after a short break, folks. We'll be right back. Okay, welcome back, folks. We've got Brother Faisal here today discussing the return of the Taliban in Afghanistan. So we've been through quite a bit so far in the first half, and pertinently, I want to ask, why did the Americans cut and run, so easily, knowing that if that the Afghan forces, of the former government, would crumble without the backing of the US air power. So the Air Force ain't back there to back them up. That army is going to crumble. So they just cut and left. Why would they do that?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen wa salatu wa salam ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. 2 points. Firstly, if we go back to the agreement, the Doha agreement on the 29th of February 2020, the Americans made it clear that fundamental to that agreement was that all US troops, and by definition NATO troops, would leave within 14 months, which meant that they should have left May of this year.
Yeah.
But then we know the Americans extended that. Perhaps there's something to read. Why did they extend their stay in Afghanistan for 3 more months? Because according to the Doha agreement, they should have left basically by the end of May. When we look at that, we already saw that a roadmap was in place where the Americans made it clear that they would leave Afghanistan. There was no negotiation on that particular point. They'd already agreed to leave. So that in itself asks a further question. Why? Do you just get up and go after 20 years, after spending $1 trillion and losing over 3,000 troops with over 30,000 injured? Why do you just get up and leave? Were you offered a better deal? Did someone offer you a better deal? Question mark. Secondly, more importantly, this issue, I mean, a lot of people are pointing fingers at Joe Biden, but we've got to realize the Doha agreement, the Doha discussions with the Taliban took place during Trump's mandate. So you could argue, well, Biden inherited it, but we know that American presidents, they can revoke, they can renege on agreements. For example, when Trump came to power, he revoked all agreements with Iran. He revoked all agreements with Cuba to the extent of withdrawing all diplomatic recognition and closing the embassy that had been opened during the time of Obama. Mm-hmm. So turning around and saying, well, Joe Biden inherited all this doesn't wash, when we know that Americans can literally rub out, tear up agreements that previous presidents have made. And history's replete of examples where they've done that.
Okay.
What's interesting is that Joe Biden has a long-standing relationship with Pakistan. In overt, covert discussion during the time of Obama, when he was vice president, he often met with Pakistani political as well as military leadership. So we can see that Joe Biden has a long-standing relationship with Pakistan.
Interesting. So, I mean, how deep is this relationship with Pakistan? That, from what you've said in the first round, is that, you know, India's the number one loser in Afghanistan with all the investment and infrastructure it's paid for. So why would the current American president, you know, allow for that switchover where you pull the plug on India, but then you favor Pakistan?
Well, as I mentioned, and really it's very clear. I mean, traditionally, rumor has it that the Pakistanis were America's main ally in Central Asia, to the extent that Pakistan formed part of CENTO, the Central Treaty Organization, in the 50s and 60s, which was an Asian equivalent of NATO, where along with Iran and other pro-Western regimes in the Middle East, they held the line against pro-Soviet and pro-Russian and pro-Soviet countries in the Middle East. That's one. Secondly, as I mentioned, again, just to repeat and reiterate, America now needs Pakistan to act as a broker with China, and Afghanistan was the asking price.
Okay.
So hence you can see Pakistan's back in town.
Pakistan is back in town. Okay. Well, I want to go back to that. I mean, we mentioned it a couple of times about the ideal situation, the ideal government in Afghanistan for the Taliban from a military point of view, from a logistics point of view, was actually the Taliban. That was the best they could have hoped for during the 1996 to 2001 rule, where they don't have to look over their shoulder, hostile Afghan government when dealing with India. So is that, would you say that's a main reason? And actually the Taliban is Pakistan's, you know, even just from a logistic point of view, the Taliban being in power in Afghanistan is like the best scenario for Pakistan.
In many ways, because don't forget, Pakistan needs a friendly government in Kabul to safeguard the Karakoram highway, which China is building, which stretches the whole length of Pakistan. So the last thing you want is a hostile government in Kabul, which may sabotage that particular economic aspect of Pakistan's economy. On top of that, we have to look at certain other realities. Afghanistan is a treasure trove. There's lithium, which is the second largest or the largest deposit in the world. The Chinese are licking their lips at that because
Of
this is
course.
where all the batteries are made, and
Absolutely.
other
I mean,
telecommunications are reliant upon lithium.
yeah, and if
So
anybody's looked into the American company Tesla, who's famously headed by Elon Musk, high quality, longer lasting lithium ion batteries are the way forward for their technology and their cars and everything else. So, according to him, even lithium ion is actually the future of battery powers and storage.
Because absolutely, because the whole premise is to wean off gas. So instead of focusing on gas and petrol, you're now having lithium batteries which have an infinitely longer lifespan. And Afghanistan just happens, quote unquote, amongst other things, to have one of the largest deposits of lithium in the world. Incidentally, they also have large gas reserves. Don't forget, there's the Pakistan, Turkmenistan, Iran, India pipeline that's supposed to stretch all the way from Turkmenistan, not Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, all the way through to Pakistan and India. So you need a government there that will, how can I say, protect your investments.
Absolutely.
Don't forget, just to touch on this point, if you remember rightly, during the first Taliban regime, there was the Unical issue about the pipeline.
Absolutely. And Mullah Umar refused that pipeline.
Absolutely.
Is that pipeline back on the table, Faisal?
Actually, it's the pipeline plus, because this pipeline actually goes from Turkmenistan, which has I think, one of the largest reserves of gas in the world. So you can see very clearly that the geopolitical aspects are fundamental in all this. It isn't just a question of women's rights, because, correct me if I'm wrong, Mohammed, the West, and if you look at, I've been watching the BBC almost non-stop for the last 3 days now.
Yeah.
All the reporters that have been interviewing Afghans and politicians and human rights activists, they've been going on about, yes, Sharia, the suppression of women's rights. My point is, if the West really cared about women's rights, why have you been bombing Afghans to mush? Tens of thousands of women and children have died as a result of your bombings. So you love women so much, you've got such concern for Afghan women that you're bombing them to pieces. I think it's a red herring completely. They don't give two hoots about anyone's rights except what's on the agenda.
What's on the agenda? Nice choice of words, Faisal. Right, so
the real agenda, I presume.
Absolutely. So, okay, we've looked at those deals, like you say. I mean, I suppose some of this, like we keep saying, it is, some of it is up in the air. We can analyze and read into certain things. Not every deal has materialized, or whether it actually exists. I suppose there's a lot remain to be seen going forward. Is there any way we can say, look, we can, although our analysis of the situation is gearing us into a particular direction, and that's a possibility or probability, is this, when we actually look at the hard facts, or look at, for example, the terms of any written agreement that's been signed, etc., is there anything there that can show us actually maybe there's some benefit of the doubt here? Maybe it's, we presuming certain deals have been made, but they may not have been. Could it be that the Americans have just pulled out, because it's costing them too much? It's not in their interest in terms of draining their pockets.
Right. From the 29th of February 2020, the Americans made it clear we're pulling out. We're going to set out a roadmap, but the end result is we're pulling out. The question is, why? Why are we pulling out? because because fundamentally they've got someone to do their bidding, protect the pipelines. Also, not just that they've got someone to do their bidding, but they've actually sold Afghanistan to Pakistan because they needed Pakistani help to broker a deal with China, as I've mentioned 2 or 3 times already. The question is, this is multifaceted. It's a multifaceted issue. I mean, there are more than one benefits, there are more than one issues involved. Yes, I'm not going to argue against the premise that the implementation of Islam as a political system is also on the cards. That's also been an issue. But when you see somebody who claims that they have an Islamic agenda, that they want to implement Islam, shaking hands with the Americans to conclude a deal, am I not right in saying that question marks come to the fore? The other question that I think you touched upon earlier with me, which we didn't actually conclude upon, I think this was just before the break.
Yeah.
The Americans spent nearly 2 decades arming and training the Afghan army with state-of-the-art weaponry. That army folded in about 10 days.
Correct.
Did the Americans not know, considering that they built the Afghan army upon the model of the US Army? The US Army is highly mechanized. It depends on the quick movement of troops with vehicles and air support. The minute the Americans said, we're pulling out and we're pulling out all our air assets, are you telling me that all these generals didn't know that they were signing the death sentence of the Afghan armed forces?
Well, if their own troops require air cover in almost every conflict that we've seen, then surely the Afghan forces would also need that air cover if they don't have their own.
I mean, on paper, the Afghan forces were 300,000 strong, but unofficially, officials will tell you if they even had 150,000 troops, that would be twice as many as they really had, because Afghan army officers were notorious in claiming they had more soldiers than they actually did, because they were claiming the money from the Americans. I mean, morale. We saw in 2014 in northern Iraq and in parts of Syria how predominantly the Iraqi army fled and melted in front of a much smaller force of mujahideen in northern Iraq in 2014. The Iraqi army that was built by the Americans. Look, giving soldiers state-of-the-art weaponry and getting them to fire rockets at targets doesn't mean a thing. You have to build a type of soldier that knows and why he is willing to die for. What is he willing to die for? He has to know what he's willing to die for. Did these Iraqi soldiers or Afghan soldiers know what they were dying for? Did they know what they were fighting for? This is the bottom line, Mohammed. And if I may quote a relevant quote from a French officer who was escaping from Dien Bien Phu in 1954 during the first Indochina War, or what is known as Vietnam. Prior to the Americans, the French got a kicking in Vietnam as well. This French officer was being flown out, and he made a memorable quote, and he said, "I now know that you can kill a man, but you can't kill a thought. You can't kill an idea." This is fundamental, Mohammed. You can kill soldiers, you can kill people, but you can't kill ideas. You can't kill ideologies.
And
the Taliban were much smaller because, as I said, I'm not contradicting myself, who said earlier on, the Taliban is not a monolith. The neo-Taliban especially is not a monolith. You do have sincere people. You have many sincere mujahideen who are fighting for the liberation of their country from Kafir soldiers and for the implementation of Islam. And this was paramount in their approach, that they feared that for them, death was just the beginning. But for a soldier who's fighting for dunya, fighting for money, fighting for America, life is the end all and be all.
Subhanallah. Okay. Excellent. So, we looked at all this, and yeah, they are sincere. We're not going here to question people's sincerity. Like you said, there's a lot going on there. There's been 20 years of hard struggle. We haven't even been through what they've been through, and sometimes it's a bit, they probably have a better understanding of their own situation than what we can read into it. What do you think the situation is? Obviously, you're an analyst, and this whole discussion is an analysis of what's going on. Going forward, what do you think will unravel going forward? You mentioned already, Pakistan being a key player, key broker, potentially the overall winner in this whole thing. Okay. You mentioned that the issue of China, and we know that also Pakistan is very close with China, and the Taliban as well have had at least a meeting with the Chinese. And then you mentioned that there's this rogue element appearing in the Tajik regions of Afghanistan, which is basically being backed by India to confront the new regime. Where does this whole thing end up going forward?
Traditionally, and unfortunately, Afghanistan has been the battlefield for other people's wars. In the 19th century, you had what was called the Great Game between the British Empire and the Russian Empire. So what we're seeing is just a continuation of that, in that the worst case scenario, as I mentioned, is that India built the two dams in Afghanistan primarily to control water flow into Pakistan and to a lesser degree into Iran, but primarily the infrastructure, the investment in Afghanistan was to keep Afghanistan on side and to continually pressurize Pakistan. Now, if India feels that the status quo in Pakistan, in Afghanistan, is going against its advantage, especially with the fanatical Hindu government in place, things may turn nasty. We may see actual Indian military intervention, possibly alone or in conjunction with Iran. And this will inevitably draw in Pakistani or Chinese troops into Afghanistan.
Okay, you mentioned Iran there. How does Iran factor into all this? Because that's the first time we mentioned it.
Iran is the largest provider of India. They are very strong allies. As I mentioned, there was an agreement of sorts during the early part of this millennium to build an equivalent to Gwadar in Iran, between like a port, a developed port for trade in Iran, in the just across the border from Afghanistan. It would have primarily benefited India and Iran, because it would have meant that India could, how can I say, they could have avoided the subcontinent and the Arabian Sea area, which would have been difficult for Indian shipping in light of the hostility with Pakistan. On top of that, we find that India has been encouraging Iran to militarize the border with Afghanistan. So India, to some degrees, has been playing a duplicitous game with even the non-Taliban governments in Afghanistan. But overall, you will find that India tried to create an axis, an anti-Pakistan axis, which involved Iran, primarily Iran and Afghanistan, and also to bolster its quote-unquote pro-Muslim perspective, because they could just turn around and say, look, we're not anti-Muslim. Look, we've got Iran, we've got UAE, we've got Saudi Arabia, we've got Afghanistan all on our sides. So it's just a PR stunt to some regards. Excuse me.
Excellent. Okay, and I think I want to round up as well, because there's one actor that we've mentioned, but we've not gone into too much detail about. And in the background is China. Ultimately, what is China's role? What is their objectives? Obviously, they're a regional power. They're a major power. They're a competitor to the United States. And what is their, in terms of backing Pakistan, backing Afghanistan, and securing their interests, obviously, through them. What is the Chinese reasoning or rationale behind this, and what's in it for them?
Well, as we mentioned just a few minutes ago, the large lithium deposits in Afghanistan, among other mineral resources, which China is eager to get its hands on for its economic development. I mean, that in itself is enough. I mean, China is heavily industrializing, not just industrializing, but militarizing. The Chinese Navy, Air Force is rapidly expanding to meet the US threat in the northeastern, eastern, and southeastern Asia. So China needs resources for all that. And Afghanistan is literally a gold mine in every respect, with large deposits of jade, lithium, uranium, gold, silver. There's even gas deposits I've heard in the southern Baluchistan areas. So China's interest is not only strategic, because don't forget, Afghanistan borders China as well.
Yeah, it does.
Afghanistan has a border, the Wakhan Strip, that goes up to the Chinese border. And also China, when the Taliban, neo-Taliban, met with the Chinese leadership in July, 28th of July this year, one of the main discussions was, when you take over, what's your relationship going to be with the Uyghurs? Because there's a nascent or a long-standing Mujahideen movement there. And unfortunately, we heard the neo-Taliban response that our country will not be used as a springboard for any destabilizing actions in other countries.
We've had a lot of that, because Imran Khan's been very mute when it comes to the Uyghur situation too. And it's like, it comes back to this China relationship, that these countries are, want that cozy relationship with the Chinese, more so than anything else, even if it's at the expense of their own Muslim brothers in other countries.
Well, you see, this is what they'll call realpolitik in the end of the day, and this all culminates from that debilitating, disgraceful, disgusting disease of nationalism, where your principle, your priority is for your country and for your quote unquote, for people of your racial, national, ethnic stock. That's where your priorities lie. And the concept of the Islamic Aqidah being the basis of our relationship no longer applies.
Yeah, unfortunately.
That's why you've seen what's been unfolding in Afghanistan, civil war. What is civil war? When people effectively fight within a territory for power. And it's inevitable. You'll have literally blood brothers fighting blood brothers for power. Nationally.
And that's unfortunately, and obviously we've seen that historically, especially in our recent history growing up, that very nationalistic Muslim world, entrenched in their self-interest, fighting each other, But at the end of the day, I mean, look, it's good you mentioned, we talked about perspective of Islamic rule, at least so they say, in Afghanistan and having the Islamic Emirate there. They will also talk, we're also talking about, ideally, although it's not been, having the Islamic Aqidah as our bond rather than nationalism and our national pride.
Right.
You know, we've heard, we've heard from many Islamic groups and Islamic scholars, and at the end of the day, these reports are traced back to the Prophet ﷺ ultimately. That the region of Khorasan in the future, which includes at the heart of Afghanistan, that is going to be a source for goodness. We're going to see Islam rise from there, and the banners of Islam will come from there. And we hear that a lot of on the YouTube speeches, the YouTube sheikhs. We had even the last person we had on this show was Sheikh Umar Baluch, and although we didn't discuss it at that time, he's even talked about that that promise of hope coming from that region. Is there any room for optimism given the situation that Afghanistan would something else would happen there? That will, have an optimistic view as at least as Muslims, and going forward, that the tables would turn perhaps in that region. Is there any, anything, any hints that gives us that this could be the region where, eventually, Muslims are empowered once again as Muslims rather than individual nations?
Mm-hmm. No, that's a very good point, because fundamentally, as a Muslim, we have to be an optimist. Optimism forms one of the foundations of our belief that we, as weak, limited human beings, we do not know what will happen to us. Mm. Our decree was set 50,000 years before our creation. Mm. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ, that Allah created man and jinn only to worship Him. Our fundamental function is to worship Allah. How do we worship Allah? Through the diktat sent through the messengers, culminating in the risala of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And we know that, as you rightly mentioned, this area is the area of Khorasan, of which there are ahadith talking about the positive and the hopeful aspects which come from that area. And I must say it was disconcerting and quite hurtful. And I must I'm sounding nostalgic, but I'll say it nevertheless, that when the Taliban, Neo-Taliban, Taliban 2.0 leadership were talking to the international press, I didn't hear the word Wilaya Khorasan being mentioned. I did not hear Khorasan being mentioned even once. Now, that says a lot, really, because if you have an Islamic perspective, it's practically impossible for you to discuss your Islamic credentials without talking about Khorasan in that particular area of all things, where, as you mentioned, it is the heart of Khorasan.
Subhanallah, subhanallah. Okay, thank you, Jazakallah khair, for your in-depth analysis of the whole situation in Afghanistan and regionally. And I hope to, inshallah, even get you on in future. Perhaps we'll be talking about some other country at that time.
Inshallah.
That's wrapped up another show. So Jazakallah khair. And inshallah, we'll be back for another show. So, Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.